Oh boy. This might be one of the toughest books I've had to review yet, because I just feel so conflicted about it. So I hope I can articulate my thoughts effectively in this review. But first things first, what is Relics, the first installment of the Chronicles of Solomon Drake, all about? This is an urban fantasy taking place in Detroit, but because the main character is a wizard, they're able to basically teleport all over the world. It's a story full of the classic myths and legends like vampires, werewolves, gnomes, wizards, dwarves, elves, goblins, and even Frankenstein. A young wizard named Solomon Drake, obviously, is giving his account about how he ended up with the power of Merlin. Yes, that Merlin. Inside of him, a secret group of wizards is under attack because they're basically guarding these ancient relics from the time of King Arthur, and chaos kind of unfolds as they start to basically unravel this conspiracy. So with that context in mind, let's dive into this indie review. The Immersion was a 7.5 out of 10. There's a lot of things that Robert did really well with the world building. I liked how there were distinct hierarchies within each of the magical factions, especially with the vampires. The vampires belong to specific families, and they have policies in place that basically ensure they maintain a healthy balance with humans and the other magical creatures. But you also get a sense that a lot of vampires aren't happy with the way things are, and they basically only see humans as food and all these other races as inferior. And this leads to conflict and histories between the different factions and magical groups that exist. Most people hate the vampires, especially the werewolves, but it is interesting to see how wizards and gnomes and dwarves all kind of fit and mesh in our world as well as their own hidden magical hierarchy. The other thing that helps urban fantasy as a whole with world building is the fact that they can actually reference things in the modern world to basically help things feel more familiar to the reader. So we'll get references to famous artists or bands or books or people or places, which does give you a good sense of this hidden magical world within the normal one. He also does a good job switching up the environment quite a bit due to all the portal travel that's going on. So that does help to add a little bit of variety and some intrigue to the story. I would say my main issue with the world building is that I do think things are a little too generic or stereotypical or predictable, such as like the vampires and werewolves being mortal enemies. Although that's a familiar trope, I think the way that it was written gave a lot more opportunities for the author to explore other ideas or to have a more unique approach to some of these more well-known creatures. The names. This is where things start to get a little tough. Ultimately, I ended up giving it a score of 6.5 out of 10. This book has one of the best tones of humor that I've read in a while. And that's mostly because we're reading from the perspective of Solomon Drake, and it's basically just his journal, and he's a young man who has kind of immature thoughts and ideas and humor, and I like that type of thing. And Robert just does a really good job articulating that inside of his internal monologue and all those kinds of things. His just personality comes through so strong inside of his head as he's writing this journal, basically. So Solomon was just a great character. I loved his sense of humor and how he looks at the world. I'm even okay with a lot of his romantic pursuits. I think that does humanize him a little bit. His motivations and experiences all fold in really well to make a very memorable and lovable personality. I liked Mary and Barnabas as his adoptive parents and teachers. Race, I thought, was a good addition as a bodyguard with his own antics with nudity in particular. It was fun to see Tilly in his role as a servant. Adriana worked, but I did feel like she was the most underdeveloped character of the bunch. Like, her motivations and personality didn't match her history or her motivations, I guess. It just, to me, there were some discrepancies with that particular character. Now, with all that said, with how much I loved these character personalities die in the dialogue. You're basically taking an 8 or a 9 level character and nerfing them in the conversations that they're having with each other. Where did all that humor and personality go when they're interacting? Why is everything so straightforward? Where's the conflict and miscommunication between such a diverse group of characters? Now, because this bugged me and dropped the score so much, I took just a couple of examples just so that you know what I mean, because I do think that it warrants just a note here. So I'm just going to go through 2 examples of dialogue. Now, I'm not going to explain the context of what's going on in these pages because I don't want to spoil anything. I just want to give a very clear example of how I think you could have added some depth to this dialogue. Okay, so the first one is, "Greetings, Abner. What brings you and your pack into Stump Waters today?" To which they respond, "We're here at the request of a very old friend that has helped me and my pack. We're just returning the favor." Oh, that's just so straightforward. I don't know anyone that talks like that. A very direct question and a very direct answer after this very intense situation has just happened. It's very tense, very unexpected, and instead of there being some tension in the dialogue to match the events that have just taken place, it's just very surface level. What I would do in this situation is something like this. "Abner, what a stroke of luck to have an entire pack of werewolves in Stumpwater today of all days. Yeah, let's call it luck." So that's just one example where there's like an innuendo implied. We as the readers know what's going on because of all the context and all the hints that you've given in foreshadowing. We can kind of pick up the rest. We don't need a straightforward answer. We can fill in the gaps based off of the context of what's going on these pages. The next one is on page 228. This is between Adriana and Solomon. Again, after a very tense situation. So I'm not going to give any context to this. I'm just going to pick out a couple lines of dialogue and show how I would tweak it so that it is showing and kind of lets us immerse ourselves a little bit more, rather than just giving us all of the information in the dialogue. They're in an office building and it was full at one point, but when they come out of the office, it's empty. Okay, so that's the only context I'll give. Solomon is asking Adriana, who is the owner of this building, a question. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "Well, Sol, I really didn't know how our meeting would end, and quite frankly, I didn't want any witnesses in the event our meeting happened to go poorly. So I made everyone, except for a few key people, leave early for the day. As it turned out, it was the smart thing to do." Do you see how that is just so flat, so static? If Adriana is this leader of an business empire and is 1,000 years old, her dialogue doesn't match that as a personality. It's so blunt and straightforward, and it's answering his questions. Like, I would almost picture her not answering his question and just ignoring him. And so this is how I would kind of tweak it so that it would have a little bit more personality in the actual words that are being spoken. "Guess your employees decided to take the day off." Because Solomon's sarcastic, that shows a little bit of sarcasm without actually asking a direct question. "One can never be too careful when wizards show up at your door unannounced. Even one as adorable as yourself." So again, you're not telling us that she sent everyone home, but we kind of get a sense that she's running things, even when she's not like actively making all these calls. She's very much aware and involved in the situation, and it gives us like a sense that she doesn't need to explain herself to this person. And basically what I think it boils down to is I think there's just way too much telling in the dialogue. I like it more when there are inferences and context clues and hints at things rather than just question, answer, very straightforward. It just, people don't talk that way. Very rarely is dialogue so direct, especially between starkly different personalities that barely know each other. The magic I gave a 7.5 out of 10. And here's why. I enjoyed the magic system quite a lot, actually. It was fun to see a classic spell system, and wizard staffs, and wands, and portals, and shields. Again, it all just felt very familiar, so it was easy to follow how the magic worked. It was also cool to see how the different races used magic, like the elves versus the wizards. Now, I don't feel like there was a very clear costs or consequences to the magic. Even though it did kind of reference it a couple of times, it just wasn't super clear. Other than like the staff or the wand helping wizards channel their power, it didn't go into a lot of depth into the requirements to wield magic or how it affected the user. But it was still fun to read all these magical battles that was taking place. But I will say that the creatures that he has are really, those were really the highlight of this book for me. The gnomes, oh my gosh, they were funny. I was literally laughing out loud anytime those dudes were on the page. especially when they attacked Bart. That whole sequence was so freaking funny. It was just comedic genius with those creatures. And because he was able to do that with the gnomes, that's why I felt like there could have been a little bit more flair with the vampires and the werewolves, just because he did such a good job with some of these lesser known magical creatures. They were so inventive and interesting and unique and funny, and we just didn't get that as much with some of the more established myths or legend creatures. Until Wilmar and the Yetis come around, those were pretty great too. I liked those. And I just think that those creatures had way less time in the book, but their uniqueness outshone all the others pretty much. Let's talk about the infrastructure. Now, I just want to say right off the bat, this was one of the most creative workarounds for an indie author that I've ever seen. Let me just read you a snippet from the very first page. I've never been much of a writer to begin with, punctuation being a major area of weakness for me. Okay, to be honest, I'm horrible at it. I sort of know where periods are supposed to go, and I use apostrophes infrequently. As for commas, well, they look nice here and there, yet I have no clue what they're for. I think my high school English teacher may have retired early from the stress of having to grade my composition papers. So for those of you still brave enough to read this after expressing my opinions on my writing abilities, I'd like to apologize in advance for all the bad grammar and punctuation errors. That is genius. It automatically made me forgive many of the mistakes in the book because it really felt like I was reading a published journal from Solomon Drake. With that said, I had to give the infrastructure a score of 5.5 out of 10. Because although it's charming and it's a great idea, I still have to ding the book for this. I think if there are a handful of mistakes, that can add a certain level of charm to the book. As I mentioned, it can feel like, oh, this is a journal. That's why there's a missing punctuation mark here or a misspelled word there. I think that actually adds a little bit to the book. It makes it feel like that's an experience as a reader that I've never had before. I liked it. But it got to the point for me where it was a distraction. It was too much. This needs an editor to clean things up pretty heavily. Just from a structural standpoint, the paragraphs, the dialogue tags, those things need a lot of work. But again, leave a few mistakes in there, a few spelling errors, a few missed punctuation marks. I think that's fine. But you do have to fix those major structuring problems, or it will be a distraction for the readers, and I do think that that will take them out of the story. There were also quite a few times throughout the story where you're telling more than you're showing. Now, again, this sort of works because of the style that has been written, where I'm reading a journal entry. So I do like how the author knew their strengths and their weaknesses going into writing a book. I think that is a great takeaway for indie authors out there. Know your strengths, know your weaknesses, and play to those. Find a way to spin them in your favor. I do think it could be cleaned up a little bit so there's not as much telling, a little bit more showing, but it's not enough to take me out of the book, personally. And the other interesting thing is I could tell the author's writing got better by the end of the book. So, like, the whole second half to me was written way better than the first half. And again, that's a good lesson for indie authors to show that actually writing a book is good to practice and improve your writing skills. And like I mentioned in another video, Brandon Sanderson says that authors need to write maybe 3 or 4 books before they really get that practice to the point where they can write something that will sell, that they get their own system down for how they're writing. And, you know, I got a little taste of that in this book where by the end of it, I'm like, okay, this is starting to flow a lot better. So with all that in mind, I also want to touch on the plot and the prose really quick, because I think those were actually done very well. Like I mentioned earlier, I actually loved the tone of this story. Very humorous, very lighthearted, very hopeful, and the plot moved forward at a really good pace. And I really just liked the unique idea of this book, and I really do think that this series has the potential to be great. My enjoyment, I would say, was a 6.5 out of 10. Like I said earlier, the grammar did make this one a lot harder for me to really enjoy, because my brain was actively fixing the problems that were wrong with the writing as I went along, rather than necessarily getting completely lost and immersed inside the story. And that's really a shame, because the actual story being told is so fun and unique. Now, I'm not too sure what the target audience Robert is trying to market to right now, but in my opinion, I think it would work best as a YA fantasy story. You've got a coming-of-age wizard, even though he's a little bit older than a teenager. You've got a lot of familiar elements to the world building, so the learning curve and entry into the story is very minimal. and you have a little bit more hand-holding with the narrative structure. And these are all things that I think young readers would actually really benefit from and enjoy. But if you are trying to market this to adults, then I think you have to fix some of those issues that I've mentioned earlier. I really enjoyed the cast getting together, the mystery unfolding, and of course the final battle was really epic. Basically from like the Yetis and Wilmar to the end was just phenomenal pacing that kept me engaged with the characters. And the resolution was also satisfying because there were real tangible consequences, painful consequences to this adventure that everyone had to grapple with. So that leaves us with an overall score of 6.7 out of 10. I do think there's a good target market for this if you like urban fantasy or if you're more into the YA style of fantasy writing. It has some King Arthur legend stuff in it, which I really enjoy. I always love anything to do with King Arthur. And it just has a large cast of mythical creatures that are fun to read about. Now, let's judge a book by the cover. Right off the bat, I think the typography needs a little bit of work. Like, it looks like generic Times New Roman or something. Like, even the subtitle and the author's name has a little bit more flair to the font. So I don't like that the actual title feels more like an afterthought. I think that it should either match with the subtitle and the author name, or it should just have something more unique to it. I love the Yetis in the background. Those things look sick, and they were very unique to the story, and it definitely helps this cover stand out. But I don't know that I like the wizard holding the sword. I know what it is, but I just don't feel like it has enough significance in this book to have it on the cover. I think a wizard with a staff, holding out a hand with fire in it, would be more appropriate for what a reader can expect from the story. And there are no other maps or artwork, so that's pretty much it for the bonus design review. So let's get this added to the shelf. If you like this book review, be sure to check out the other book reviews that I've done so far. And if you haven't already, join the club. We love supporting the fantasy genre from outside traditional influence. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.